He walked in asking for nothing more than bread, but his question, and what followed, shattered the foundation of a billion-dollar legacy. The Sterling Stride Gallery was alive with champagne laughter and the quiet arrogance of the city's elite. Shoes gleamed on glass pedestals like sacred relics, symbols of wealth and power. Then, silence. Just inside the towering glass doors stood a man in a tattered coat, clutching a weathered leather roll. His boots were worn to whispers, his face lined by years the crowd couldn't imagine. He wasn't supposed to be there. His voice, low but steady, cut through the murmurs. "Could I fix a pair for food?" Laughter erupted. A beggar daring to touch shoes worth more than his life? Impossible. But what none of them knew, what none of them could fathom, was that this man's hands carried a truth capable of unraveling everything. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. He could build a man's life from the ground up, starting with his shoes. An old man in a worn-out coat clutched a small, weathered tool roll, his eyes fixed on a single pair of shoes displayed like a king's crown. His simple request for a meal was about to unravel a legacy of lies, one careful stitch at a time. The air inside the Sterling Stride flagship gallery was not meant for ordinary breathing. It was a cold, sterile atmosphere, smelling faintly of Italian leather, expensive cleaning products, and the self-satisfaction of the city's wealthiest citizens. The room was a monument to minimalism and money. Towering white walls were bare except for the occasional, strategically lit glass pedestal. Upon each pedestal sat a single pair of shoes, isolated and illuminated like a sacred relic in a museum. These were not just shoes. They were declarations. Each pair of gleaming Oxfords, hand-polished loafers, and pristine dress boots represented a small fortune. They were the footwear of CEOs, investment bankers, and the kind of men who inherited empires. They were sold not as footwear, but as a foothold into a higher class of existence. Tonight, the gallery was hosting its most exclusive event of the year, the launch of the Legacy line. 200 of the city's elite mingled between the pedestals, their voices a low, confident hum that echoed off the polished concrete floors. Champagne flutes tinkled like brittle laughter. Diamonds on wrists and necks caught the sharp gallery lights, scattering tiny rainbows over a sea of tailored suits and designer dresses. They moved with the unthinking grace of people who had never been denied anything important. Into this temple of polished perfection, a ghost drifted in from the street. He did not make a sound, yet his presence was a deafening roar. He stood just inside the massive glass doors, a man seemingly assembled from forgotten things. His coat, a drab olive green, was frayed at the cuffs and bore the faint, pale stains of countless rains. His gray hair was thin and wind-whipped, and a beard of the same color covered a face that was a roadmap of a hard life. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, held a quiet, assessing stillness. They scanned the room, taking in the shimmering dresses and dismissive glances, not with the desperation of a beggar, but with the steady gaze of a craftsman evaluating his materials. In his right hand, he held a small, rolled-up bundle of cracked leather, tied shut with a simple leather thong. It was the only thing about him that seemed to have been cared for. His shoes were old-work boots, scuffed and cracked, the soles worn so thin they looked like whispers of their former selves. Each step he took on the gleaming floor felt like an act of quiet rebellion. A ripple of silence began to spread from the entrance, a wave of discomfort moving through the crowd. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Eyes accustomed to judging a man's worth by the brand of his watch narrowed with a mixture of confusion and contempt. "What is he doing in here?" a woman whispered to her husband, pulling her fur stole tighter around her shoulders as if his poverty were a cold draft. "Security must be asleep," the man muttered back, his eyes darting around for someone to blame. The ghost took another slow, deliberate step forward. The hum of the room had died into a tense, expectant silence. He seemed not to notice their hostility. His attention was captured by the centerpiece of the exhibit, the Sterling Stride Founder's Oxford, displayed alone on a black marble block. The shoe was a masterpiece of black calfskin, polished to a mirror shine. A small placard next to it read, "A tradition of perfection, hand-stitched since 1948. The old man's eyes lingered on the stitching along the shoe's welt. He leaned in slightly, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me." A voice finally cut through the silence. It was low and raspy, the sound of a voice not often used. All I snapped to him. The old man turned his gaze from the shoe to the crowd. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular, yet he seemed to address them all. "I don't mean to intrude," he said, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "I was just wondering if I could get a plate of food." A single, sharp laugh broke the tension. The sound was as sharp and unpleasant as breaking glass. The laughter belonged to Bradley Sterling. He stood near the center of the room, a tall, handsome man of about 40, with a cruel smile and an air of entitlement that was more precisely tailored than his $1,000 suit. He was the CEO of Sterling Stride, the grandson of the founder and the host of this evening's gala. He had inherited his position, not earned it, and he wore his authority with the arrogance of a man who believes his good fortune is a sign of his own superiority. To Bradley, the world was divided into two groups: people like him, who mattered, and people like the old man, who were invisible. "Food," Bradley repeated, stepping forward. He made a show of looking the old man up and down, a theatrical sneer on his face. "This is a private launch party, my good man, not a soup kitchen. How on earth did you get past the door?" From a corner of the room, a young woman watched, her stomach twisting into a tight knot. Her name was Clara Jenkins, an intern in the company's design department. She was here tonight to hand out brochures and smile, a small cog in a large, glittering machine. She was barely 22, working 2 jobs to pay for her design school tuition, and she was in awe of the craftsmanship her company was supposed to represent. Seeing the old man, she felt a pang of recognition. He reminded her of her grandfather, a carpenter who had worked with his hands until they were gnarled and stiff, but who had always carried himself with a quiet dignity. The old man seemed unfazed by Bradley's mockery. His pale blue eyes met the CEO's. "The door was open," he said simply. "I saw the shoes, and I smelled the food. I haven't eaten a proper meal in a while. And that is our problem, how?" Bradley shot back, raising his voice for the benefit of his audience. "This is a city of opportunity. If you're hungry, it's because you've made poor choices. It's called personal responsibility." A murmur of agreement rippled through the guests. They nodded, their faces smug, secure in the knowledge that they had all made the right choices. The old man's gaze drifted from Bradley's face down to his feet. Bradley was wearing a pair of the new Legacy loafers, a shade of deep burgundy, so perfect it seemed unreal. "Those are fine shoes, sir," the old man said, his voice still quiet. Bradley's chest puffed out. "They are the finest in the world. The culmination of 75 years of sterling craftsmanship." "I see that," the old man said, taking another step closer. "But it looks like you've picked up a loose stitch on the right toe cap." Bradley froze. He instinctively glanced down. He couldn't see anything, but the old man's confidence had planted a seed of doubt. A faint flush of anger crept up his neck. How dare this nobody criticize his product? "That's impossible," Bradley snapped. "These are flawless." "Almost," the old man corrected him gently. "It happens, even with the best work. But a loose stitch, if you don't fix it, will unravel. The whole toe cap could come loose." He paused, his eyes lifting to meet Bradley's again. "I could fix it for you. Right now. That, and the scuff on the heel." He held up his weathered leather bundle. "I have my tools. It would take me 10 minutes. I'm a cobbler." The sheer absurdity of the offer hung in the cold, still air. A homeless man, a beggar, was offering to repair the priceless shoes of the company's CEO in the middle of his own party. Bradley stared for a moment, and then he threw his head back and roared with laughter. It was a horrible, braying sound, full of malice. Soon, other guests joined in, their polite titters growing into a wave of cruel amusement that washed over the old man. He just stood there, his expression unchanged, waiting for the laughter to die down. Clara felt her cheeks burn with secondhand shame. She wanted to say something, to walk over and lead the old man away from this humiliation. But she was just an intern. Getting involved would be professional suicide. Her boss, a severe woman named Margaret, was already giving her a warning look from across the room. Clara stayed frozen in her spot, hating herself for her own cowardice. "You're a cobbler?" Bradley finally gasped, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "A cobbler who can't even afford his own shoes wants to fix mine?" That is the richest thing I've ever heard. I don't want your money, the old man said, his voice steady despite the mockery. Just a plate of food from the buffet. I'll fix the stitch, and I'll polish both your shoes. You won't even know I was here. Bradley's eyes gleamed with a sudden, vicious idea. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He saw a chance for some entertainment, a way to underscore the difference between the worthless and the worthy. He held up a hand for silence, and the room quieted instantly, everyone eager to see what he would do. You know what? Bradley announced, his voice booming with false generosity. I think we should let him. Let's give our guest a chance to demonstrate his skills. A confused murmur went through the room. Here's the deal, Bradley said, pointing a manicured finger at the old man. His name was Elias Vance, but no one in that room knew it. To them, he was a nameless problem. I happened to have a pair of shoes that were damaged in shipping. My quality control team said they were unsalvageable. A total loss. He snapped his fingers at a nervous-looking assistant. Henry, go to my office. Bring me the damaged pair of centurions. The ones with the gouge in the side. Henry scurried off, looking terrified. Bradley turned back to Elias, his smile widening. Here is my proposition. I'll give you these ruined shoes. If you can make them look perfect again, and I mean sterling perfect, I will personally give you $1,000. Cash. The crowd buzzed. It was a grotesque game, and they were all ready to watch. But, Bradley added, his voice dropping for dramatic effect, when you fail, and let's be honest, we all know you will fail, my security guards will escort you out of here, and you will crawl back to whatever alley you came from. We will all get to see, firsthand, what happens when a man's reach exceeds his grasp. Elias looked at Bradley, his pale eyes calm. He felt their hunger for his humiliation. It was a familiar feeling. He had seen that same look in the eyes of guards and interrogators a lifetime ago. It was the hunger of the powerful to confirm their own superiority by witnessing the degradation of another. Where should I work? Elias asked, his voice even. Work? Bradley laughed. We'll set up a little station for you. Right here, in the center of the room, so everyone can watch. He had a few waiters clear a small space and bring over a low stool and a small table. It looked like a stage for a public shaming. Place your bets, everyone, a man shouted from the back. I'll give him 5 minutes before he makes it worse, yelled another. I'll bet $100 those hands haven't touched leather polish in 20 years, laughed a woman dripping with diamonds. Her laughter was as cold and empty as the glass pedestals around her. Henry, the assistant, returned, holding a beautiful wooden shoebox. He handled it as if it contained a venomous snake. He opened the box and placed a single, ruined shoe on the small table. The crowd gasped. It was a beautiful brown leather Oxford, but a deep, ugly gash ran across its side, tearing through the fine calfskin and breaking the delicate stitching. It looked like it had been slashed with a knife. It was, by all appearances, hopelessly ruined. There you are, cobbler, Bradley sneered. Your canvas. Let's see you make your magic. Elias moved toward the table. He adopted a slow, slightly pained shuffle, letting his shoulders slump. Every movement was part of the story he was telling them, the story of a broken, useless old man. He sat on the low stool and looked at the wounded shoe. He then reached down and untied the leather thong on his tool roll. He unrolled it slowly on the table. The leather of the roll itself was ancient and dark with age, but the tools nestled inside were immaculate. There were strangely shaped knives, sharp-looking awls, various needles, and small, polished pieces of bone and wood. They were not modern tools. They looked like museum pieces, each one worn smooth from a lifetime of use. They gleamed under the gallery lights, a stark contrast to the man who owned them. For a brief second, a flicker of confusion crossed a few of the guests' faces. Beggars didn't have tools like that. Elias picked up the ruined shoe. His hands, which looked so rough and chapped, handled the delicate leather with an impossible gentleness. He ran a single, calloused finger along the edge of the gash, his eyes closed, as if he were reading a story written in the damaged hide. Before you begin, Bradley said, pulling up a sleek designer chair to watch the show, let me make the terms a little more interesting. He paused, savoring the attention of the room. If, by some miracle, you actually manage to impress us, I'll double the offer. $2,000. And a lifetime supply of sterling stride shoes. The room erupted in laughter. A lifetime supply of shoes for a man who lived on the street. The cruelty was exquisite. Offering it was a way of saying that the man's ultimate, impossible achievement was worth less than their own footwear budget for a single year. Elias said nothing. He simply picked up a small, curved knife from his roll. The steel shone, its edge impossibly sharp. "What's your name, old man?" Bradley demanded, settling into his chair like a king at an execution. Elias looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting Bradley's. The mask of the weary beggar was still in place, but beneath it, a cold fire was beginning to burn. The test had begun, and the subjects had no idea they were the ones being graded. "Elias," he said, his voice quiet. "My name is Elias Vance." The name meant nothing to them. It was just a name, as disposable as the man himself. Elias lowered his head and turned his full attention to the shoe. He took a small, clean cloth from his roll and began to gently wipe away the dust from the leather. The room fell silent. 200 pairs of eyes were fixed on his hands, waiting for him to fail. They waited for the clumsy slip of the knife, the fumbling stitch that would confirm everything they believed about the world. That some people were simply born to succeed, and others were born to be ground under their perfect, polished heels. He worked with a slowness that was both maddening and mesmerizing. He didn't rush. He first assessed the damage with the focus of a surgeon examining a patient. His fingers probed the torn leather, testing its thickness, its pliability. He sniffed it, his eyes closed, discerning the quality of the tanning process from the faint scent alone. Is he going to do anything or just stare at it all night? Someone whispered from the crowd, but the whisper was edged with a strange fascination. Bradley leaned forward, a smug smile on his face. "Patience, everyone. Great failure takes time." Elias ignored them all. He selected a small, sharp tool from his roll, a clicking knife with a curved blade. With a surgeon's precision, he began to skive the edges of the gash, thinning the leather on both sides of the tear. His hand was impossibly steady. There were no wasted movements, no hesitation. The blade moved in a single, fluid arc, peeling away a paper-thin layer of leather. It was a technique that required decades of practice to master. One slip would make the damage irreparable. Clara Jenkins watched, holding her breath. In her design classes, they had studied old-world shoemaking techniques from textbooks. Skiving a clean edge on scrap leather was something she'd spent a month trying to perfect, with clumsy results. This old man did it as easily as breathing. He was not just shaving the leather. He was preparing it, shaping it, talking to it in a language only his hands knew. Next, he took out a small jar from his kit. It contained a thick, amber-colored paste. He opened it, and a faint, pleasant smell of beeswax and pine tar filled the air around the table. It was his own mixture, a recipe passed down through generations. He applied a tiny amount of the adhesive to the skived edges of the leather. He didn't just smear it on. He worked it into the fibers with a small, smooth piece of bone, ensuring a perfect bond. Then came the most critical part. He brought the two edges of the gash together. It was like watching a wound being closed. The two sides met perfectly, the seam so tight, it was almost invisible. He held it in place for a long minute, his eyes focused, his breathing slow and even. The world outside his small workspace seemed to disappear. There was only the man, his tools, and the broken thing he was mending. "What is that?" A man in the front row, a rival shoe designer, muttered to his wife. "That's not a standard bookbinder's paste. And look at his skiving angle, it's flawless." Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This wasn't the clumsy spectacle he had envisioned. The old man wasn't fumbling. He was working with a quiet, unnerving competence. "He's just gluing it," Bradley said loudly, trying to reclaim control of the narrative. "A cheap trick. It will never hold. The moment the shoe is worn, it will split right open." Elias seemed not to hear him. He now reached for a needle and a spool of dark, waxed thread. This was the moment of truth. The stitch. He threaded the needle with a fluid motion. He didn't use a thimble. His calloused fingertips were his thimble. He began to sew. It wasn't the kind of stitching done by a machine or even by a standard craftsman. He pushed the needle through the leather, then looped the thread back on itself, creating a tiny, interlocking knot with each pass. It was a saddle stitch, but done with a speed and precision that was breathtaking. His hands moved in a blur, one pushing the needle, the other pulling the thread taut, the rhythm constant and perfect. The sound in the silent room was a soft, steady, the whisper of thread passing through leather. The seam he created was not just a repair, it was a work of art. It was a thin, perfectly straight line of stitches, each one identical in size and tension. The gash was disappearing, not just closed, but erased, replaced by a line of beautiful, deliberate craftsmanship. Clara felt a tear slide down her cheek. She wasn't just watching a shoe being repaired. She was watching a master at his work. This was the soul of the craft, the very thing that had drawn her to this profession. It was a dedication to perfection and beauty that her own company only talked about in its marketing brochures. This old, homeless man possessed more artistry in his little finger than Bradley Sterling had in his entire, pampered body. The rival designer in the front row was now standing, his eyes wide. "That's not possible," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "That stitch, the tension, the angle of the cast. I've only ever seen it in textbooks. It's a Greaves interlocking stitch. No one has been able to properly replicate it for 50 years. It's a lost art." The room was now utterly captivated. The mockery was gone, replaced by a stunned, reluctant awe. They had come to see a beggar fail, and instead, they were witnessing a quiet miracle. The waiters had stopped serving. The security guards had moved closer, their faces slack with wonder. The music, which had been playing softly, now seemed intrusive and was quietly turned off. The only sound was the gentle, rhythmic whisper of Elias's needle. Bradley's face was pale. The knot of panic in his stomach was tightening. This wasn't going according to plan at all. The old man was supposed to be a clown, a fool to be laughed at and discarded. But the man at the table was a king on a throne of his own making, his quiet competence a rebuke to Bradley's loud arrogance. The shoe was becoming an indictment, each perfect stitch a judgment against him. Elias finished the line of stitching. He knotted the thread, snipped it with a tiny, sharp pair of shears, and then did something unexpected. He took a small, smooth stone from his kit and began to burnish the seam, rubbing it with a steady, circular motion. The friction created heat, which melted the wax in the thread and sealed the paste beneath, fusing the leather together. The seam, already so fine, began to disappear into the surface of the shoe, becoming one with the original material. Finally, he took out another jar, this one containing a dark, rich cream polish. He applied a small amount with his finger, working it into the leather in slow, patient circles. He massaged the hide, bringing back its color and luster. He worked on the entire shoe, not just the repaired area. His hands moved with a lover's tenderness, restoring the shoe's soul. He finished with a soft flannel cloth, buffing the shoe to a deep, impossible shine. When he was done, he placed the shoe back on the table. He had not just fixed the gash. The gash was gone, vanished, as if it had never existed. The shoe did not look repaired. It looked perfect, better than new. The leather seemed to glow with an inner light, and the seam of the repair was only visible if you knew exactly where to look. And even then, it looked like a deliberate, beautiful detail. Elias sat back on his stool and looked up at Bradley, his expression calm, his pale blue eyes clear and steady. "I believe," he said, his voice no longer raspy but clear as a bell, "that I am finished." No one moved. No one spoke. The entire room was holding its breath. They had witnessed an act of transformation so complete it felt like magic. The silence that followed was heavy with shame, awe, and the dawning, terrible realization that they had made a profound and catastrophic mistake. Bradley Sterling stared at the shoe. His mind, which was usually a whirlwind of stock prices, marketing slogans, and dinner reservations, had gone completely blank. The shoe on the table was a physical impossibility. It was a refutation of everything he understood about his own business. His company, with all its state-of-the-art machinery and highly paid designers, had declared that shoe to be trash, a write-off. And this nothing of a man had resurrected it in 20 minutes with a few old tools and a quiet intensity that was more intimidating than any corporate boardroom showdown. The silence in the room stretched for a full minute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, filled with the unspoken shame of 200 wealthy people who had just been proven spectacularly wrong. They had come for a spectacle of failure, a cheap laugh at the expense of a lesser being. Instead, they had been given a masterclass in a forgotten art. Their smug certainty had been shattered, and in its place was a gaping void of confusion and dawning respect. It was the rival shoe designer, a man named Julian Croft, who finally broke the spell. He walked forward slowly, as if approaching a holy relic. He leaned over the table, his eyes wide with a professional reverence that bordered on worship. He didn't dare touch the shoe, but he examined it from every angle. "The welt," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "He didn't just close the gash in the upper. He's re-welted that entire section of the sole. The stitching is invisible." He looked up, his eyes finding Elias. "Where did you learn to do that? That's not just shoemaking. That's restoration at a level I've never seen." Elias looked at the man, a flicker of something, not quite a smile, but a quiet acknowledgement, in his pale blue eyes. "I learned from a man who believed a shoe wasn't just something you wear on your foot," he said, his voice calm and clear. "He believed it was the foundation a man builds his life on. If the foundation is weak, the man will stumble." Bradley finally found his voice. It came out as a strangled croak. "It's a trick," he stammered, shoving himself out of his chair. "A clever trick. He must have swapped the shoe." But the accusation was pathetic, and everyone in the room knew it. The shoe was undeniably the same one Henry had brought from the office. The unique grain of the leather, the specific shade of brown, it was all there. The only difference was that the fatal flaw was gone, replaced by a perfection that seemed to mock the very idea of imperfection. "There was no trick, Mr. Sterling," Julian Croft said, not taking his eyes off the shoe. "I watched his hands every second. What we have just witnessed is genius. The kind of genius this industry has lost." He finally looked at Bradley, and there was a new expression on his face, contempt. "You should be on your knees, thanking him for gracing your gallery with this demonstration." Bradley's face, which had been pale with shock, now turned a blotchy, furious red. He was being challenged, upstaged, and humiliated in his own showroom, in front of his most important clients. And the instrument of his humiliation was a homeless old man. The injustice of it, the sheer impossibility, was more than his fragile ego could bear. "Get him out of here," Bradley snarled, waving a trembling hand at his security guards. "The deal is off. He used some kind of cheap glue. It's a sham. Get him out." The two guards, large men in ill-fitting black suits, took a step forward, but they hesitated. Their faces were a mixture of confusion and reluctance. They had just seen what everyone else had seen. To lay hands on this old man now felt like a kind of sacrilege. "I believe," Elias said, his voice cutting through the tension with the clean precision of his own clicking knife, "that your offer was $2,000 and a lifetime supply of shoes." He slowly began to pack his tools away, each movement deliberate and unhurried. He was no longer the shuffling, broken man who had entered the gallery. He sat straight, his shoulders back, and in his posture was the quiet, unshakable authority of a man who is master of his domain. "You're not getting a single dime," Bradley shrieked, his voice cracking. He was losing control, and he knew it, which only made him angrier. "You are a trespasser and a fraud. Guards, do your job. Now." But before the guards could move, a new voice spoke, cutting through the ugly scene. "I don't think that will be necessary." The voice was quiet, yet it carried an unmistakable weight of authority. It came from the back of the room, from an old man who had been sitting quietly in a corner all evening, observing the proceedings with a detached, watchful air. He was a small, frail-looking man in a simple, well-worn tweed jacket. He had been invited to every Sterling Stride event for the past 50 years, though he rarely spoke to anyone. He was Mr. Abernathy, the company's longtime legal counsel and the executor of the Sterling family estate. He had been a close friend and confidant of the company's founder, Arthur Sterling, Bradley's grandfather. Mr. Abernathy walked slowly to the front of the room, his old eyes fixed on Elias. He stopped beside the table and looked down at the repaired shoe. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "It's been a long time, Elias," he said softly. Elias looked up and met the old lawyer's gaze. The mask of the weary beggar fell away completely, and for the first time, the room saw the man who was truly there. The exhaustion was still in his eyes, but it was overshadowed by a deep, abiding strength and a profound sadness. "Hello, William," Elias said, his voice now imbued with a quiet dignity that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. Bradley stared at the two men, his mouth hanging open. You know this bum?" he stammered at Mr. Abernathy. Mr. Abernathy did not look at Bradley. He kept his eyes on Elias. "I know this man very well," he said. "He was your grandfather's best friend. His partner." and the true soul of this company. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The air crackled with the sudden, shocking revelation. Mr. Abernathy turned to face the stunned audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice ringing with the clarity of a courtroom pronouncement, "allow me to introduce you to Elias Vance." He was not just the master craftsman who taught Arthur Sterling everything he knew about making shoes. He was the co-founder of Sterling Stride. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The story was impossible, unbelievable, yet as they looked from the calm, dignified face of Elias Vance to the perfectly repaired shoe on the table, they knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that it was true. "That's a lie," Bradley sputtered, his face a mask of disbelief and panic. "My grandfather founded this company alone. This man is a nobody." "Your grandfather was the face of the company, Bradley," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice cold and sharp. "He was the salesman, the businessman. But Elias was the hands. He was the artist. Every original Sterling Stride design, every technique that this company built its reputation on, came from this man." He gestured to the shoe on the table. "That stitch that Mr. Croft identified? The Greaves interlocking stitch? Elias didn't learn it from a textbook. He invented it. Your grandfather used to call it the Vance stitch." Clara Jenkins felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She gripped the edge of a nearby pedestal to steady herself. Elias Vance. The name was not in any of the company's official histories. But now that she heard it, a vague memory surfaced from her research in the company archives. A single, faded photograph from the late 1940s, showing a young Arthur Sterling standing outside a small workshop. Next to him was another young man, with intense eyes and strong, capable-looking hands. The photo was unlabeled. She had assumed he was just an early employee. "During the war," Mr. Abernathy continued, his voice dropping, "both Arthur and Elias served together. Elias was a medic. He saved your grandfather's life on the battlefield, carrying him 2 miles on his back after he was hit by shrapnel. They made a promise to each other, that if they survived, they would build something beautiful together, something that would last." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. And they did. They started in a small garage, with nothing but a set of old tools that had belonged to Elias's father. Arthur was the showman. Elias was the craftsman. He worked in the back, away from the customers, content to let his hands do the talking. He never wanted his name on the sign. He only cared about the work. Elias looked down at his own hands, a faint, bittersweet memory playing across his face. He remembered the smell of that garage, the endless hours, the shared dream. It felt like another lifetime. "What happened?" Julian Croft asked, his voice filled with a genuine, horrified curiosity. "Why did he leave? Why is his name unknown?" Mr. Abernathy's gaze hardened as he finally turned to look at Bradley. "Because after your grandfather passed away, Bradley's father, Richard, took over the company. Richard was a man who cared more for profits than for perfection. He began to cut corners, to replace quality materials with cheaper ones, to phase out the time-consuming hand-stitching in favor of mass-production machines. Elias fought him at every turn. He refused to compromise the quality of the shoes. He said it was a betrayal of the promise he and Arthur had made. The story was now a tragedy, and the entire room was its captive audience. Richard saw Elias not as a partner, but as an obstacle. So, he did what greedy, fearful men do. He cheated. He used a legal loophole in their original partnership agreement to force Elias out, buying his half of the company for a pittance. He then systematically erased Elias from the company's history. He destroyed records, removed photographs, and told everyone that Elias had simply decided to leave. Mr. Abernathy looked at Elias, his eyes filled with a deep, decades-old sorrow. And Elias, being the man he is, did not fight him. He was a craftsman, not a lawyer. He was heartbroken. He had lost his friend, and now he had lost their shared dream. He just walked away. He took his tools, and he disappeared. The truth landed with the force of a physical blow. The entire Sterling Stride legacy, the tradition of perfection they were celebrating tonight, was built on a lie. A lie of omission that was more profound than any outright fabrication. They were celebrating a heritage that had been stolen from the very man they had just mocked and humiliated. All eyes in the room now turned to Bradley Sterling. He was no longer a charismatic CEO. He was the pathetic heir to a stolen kingdom, a fraud wearing the stolen crown. His arrogance, his cruelty, his casual dismissal of the old man at the door, it all now seemed not just unkind, but grotesque. He had laughed at the king while sitting on a throne the king himself had built. "So you see, Bradley," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice dripping with a cold, righteous anger that had been simmering for 30 years. "When you offered to give this man a lifetime supply of your shoes, you were offering to give him back a fraction of what was already his. When you challenged him to prove his skill, you were challenging the very source of this company's greatness." Bradley's face was ashen. He stumbled backward, shaking his head, his world crumbling around him. The foundation of his life, his identity, his wealth, it had all been a lie. He wasn't the proud grandson of a visionary genius. He was the grandson of a good man, but the son of a thief. He looked at Elias, at the calm, unwavering gaze of the man he had tried to break for sport. In those pale blue eyes, he didn't see hatred or a desire for revenge. He saw something far worse. He saw pity. Elias Vance had not come here for revenge. He had not come to expose the Sterlings. He had come, as he said, because he was hungry. He was a man who had lost everything, a ghost drifting through a world that had forgotten him. He had seen the shoes in the window, the legacy of his own hands, and had been drawn in by a memory. The rest had been a test. Not a test of his skill, but a test of their character. And they had failed in a way that was more spectacular and more damning than any torn piece of leather. Elias slowly stood up. He had finished packing his tools. He rolled the old leather bundle and tied the thong. He looked at the repaired shoe, still sitting on the table like a perfect, silent accusation. "Keep the shoe," he said, his voice quiet but resonant in the silent room. "A gift, to remind you of what this company was supposed to be." He then turned to the buffet table, the original object of his quest. He picked up a small plate and placed a single bread roll on it. It was all he had ever asked for. He turned to leave. He didn't look at Bradley. He didn't look at the stunned crowd. He had done what he came to do. He had shown them the truth. What they did with it was their burden, not his. "Wait." It was Clara. She pushed her way through the paralyzed crowd, her face streaked with tears. She reached Elias just as he was about to walk out the door. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice choked with emotion. I'm so sorry. For what he did. For what they all did. What you did tonight. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." Elias looked at the young woman, at her earnest, tear-filled eyes. He saw in her the same passion for the craft that he and Arthur had once shared. He saw hope. He gave her a small, genuine smile. It was the first time he had smiled all evening, and it transformed his face, chasing away some of the deep, weary lines. "The beauty was always in the leather," he said. "You just have to be quiet enough to listen to it." He then turned and walked out the glass doors, disappearing into the cold night as silently as he had arrived. He left behind a shattered party, a ruined CEO, and a room full of people who had been forced to look into the mirror and see the ugliness of their own souls. The legend of Sterling Stride was dead, and in its place, the quiet, powerful truth of Elias Vance had just been born. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The story of what happened in the gallery that night spread through the city like wildfire. It was a perfect scandal, a morality tale for the modern age, the forgotten founder, the arrogant heir, the public humiliation. Julian Croft, the rival designer, gave an on-the-record interview to a major newspaper describing the miracle he had witnessed. The article, titled "The Cobbler and the King," went viral. Sterling Stride's stock plummeted. Their brand, built on a carefully crafted image of heritage and integrity, was now synonymous with fraud and cruelty. Bradley's most important clients, the very people who had witnessed his downfall, began to pull their accounts. They could not afford to be associated with such a tainted name. Within a week, the board of directors called an emergency meeting. Bradley Sterling was forced to resign in disgrace. He became a pariah, a walking symbol of entitled arrogance. He lost his company, his reputation, and the hollow respect of his peers. He was left with nothing but his money, which now felt as cheap and empty as his own character. Mr. Abernathy, as the executor of the Sterling estate, took temporary control of the company. His first official act was to launch a public search for Elias Vance. He put out advertisements in every newspaper and on every local news channel. He offered a public apology on behalf of the company and announced his intention to right the historical wrong that had been done. He wanted to give Elias his rightful place in the company's history and to compensate him for the decades of stolen legacy. Clara Jenkins was put in charge of the search. It was a daunting task. Elias had vanished back into the city's anonymous streets. He had no address, no phone number, no paper trail. He was a ghost once more. Clara spent weeks searching. She visited every shelter, every soup kitchen, every place where the city's forgotten people gathered. She showed his picture, a grainy image she had found in the archives, to anyone who would listen. She was driven by a powerful sense of duty and a deep, personal admiration for the master craftsman she had seen at work. She finally found him, not in a shelter, but in a small, dusty shoe repair shop in a forgotten neighborhood on the poor side of town. The shop was called Second Soul, and it was barely a hole in the wall. But the moment she stepped inside, she knew she had found him. The air smelled of beeswax, pine tar, and old leather. On the shelves were rows of repaired shoes, each one bearing the mark of a master's touch. Elias was sitting at a workbench in the back, stitching a new sole onto a child's worn-out boot. He was not wearing his old, tattered coat. He was wearing a simple leather apron. He looked up as she entered, his pale blue eyes unsurprised, as if he had been expecting her. He looked at peace. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice soft. "Hello, Clara," he said, putting down his tools. "I was wondering when you'd find me." "The company wants to make things right," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "They want to give you back your shares, your place in the company. Mr. Abernathy is offering you the position of CEO." Elias listened patiently. When she was finished, he shook his head slowly. "That company is not my company anymore, Clara. It hasn't been for a long time. It is a brand, a label. I am a cobbler. I mend shoes." He gestured around his small shop. "This is my place. Here, the work is honest. A person brings me something broken, and I make it whole again. There is no lie in that." He told her that he had used the $2,000 from Bradley, which Mr. Abernathy had insisted on sending to him via a private investigator, to rent this small shop and get back on his feet. It was all he needed. It was all he had ever wanted. A place to do his work. Clara understood. To put him in a boardroom would be to put him in a cage. His genius did not lie in managing spreadsheets and marketing campaigns. It lay in his hands, in his connection to the craft. But she couldn't just leave. "What should I tell them?" she asked. "The company is falling apart. They've lost their way. They need you." Elias was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Tell them this," he finally said. "Tell them to stop selling stories and start making shoes again. Tell them to remember that quality is not a marketing slogan. It's a promise. And a promise, like a good stitch, is meant to hold." He then looked at her, his eyes full of a teacher's warmth. "But you, Clara, you have the soul of a true craftsman. You understand. The future of that company, if it is to have one, is in hands like yours, not mine." Clara left the shop with a new sense of purpose. She delivered Elias's message to Mr. Abernathy. And then, with the old lawyer's blessing, she began to change the company from the inside out. She was promoted from intern to head of a new artisan division. Her first act was to reinstitute the old apprenticeship programs that Elias had started decades ago. She sought out young, passionate designers and craftsmen, people who cared more about the quality of the welt than the size of their office. She began to steer Sterling Stride away from the mass-produced, soulless products they had become known for. She focused on a new line, based on Elias's original designs, which she had unearthed from the archives. The line was called the Vance Collection. It was made with the finest materials, using the old, time-honored techniques. The shoes were expensive, but they were built to last a lifetime. They were built on a foundation of honesty. The company did not recover overnight. It was a long, slow process. But gradually, it began to earn back the public's trust. It became a different kind of company, smaller, perhaps, but better, more honest, more real. Clara would visit Elias in his small shop from time to time. She would bring him new designs to look at, or simply sit and watch him work, learning more from his silent movements than she ever had from a textbook. He never took any official role in the new company, but he was its spiritual center, its quiet, guiding hand. One afternoon, about a year after that fateful night in the gallery, she found him finishing a pair of black Oxford shoes. They were the most beautiful shoes she had ever seen. The leather glowed, and the stitching was a testament to a lifetime of dedication. "A special order?" she asked. "For an old friend," he said, buffing them one last time. The next day, a package was delivered to the home of Bradley Sterling. He was a changed man, humbled and broken by his public fall from grace. He had sold his mansion and now lived a quiet, solitary life. He opened the package. Inside was the pair of black Oxfords from Elias's workshop. There was a simple note attached. It read, "A man needs a good foundation to rebuild his life on. E.V." Bradley held the shoes in his hands. He ran his fingers over the flawless stitching, and for the first time in his life, he understood. He understood the value of true craftsmanship, of honesty, of a promise kept. He understood the legacy that he had so arrogantly claimed and so carelessly thrown away. He placed the shoes on the floor and, for the first time, stepped into a foundation that was strong enough to hold the weight of his own redemption. The pair of black Oxfords sat on Bradley Sterling's small dining table for a week. He didn't wear them. He didn't even touch them again after taking them out of the box. They were a silent, gleaming monument to his failure, a constant reminder of the man he had been and the hollow legacy he had inherited. In their flawless construction, he saw the ghost of a grandfather he'd never truly known and the living embodiment of a man he had tried to destroy for sport. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were haunted by the rhythm of Elias's needle, a sound that had become the metronome of his conscience. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the image of those calm, pale blue eyes seared into his mind. The pity in them was a fire that burned away all his old certainties, leaving him raw and exposed. His money, his name, his former status, it was all ash. One morning, he knew he couldn't live with the silence of the shoes any longer. He couldn't atone for his father's sins or reclaim the honor of his grandfather's name. But he could, perhaps, learn. He had spent his entire life managing a company whose soul he had never understood. Now, he felt a desperate, gnawing need to understand the work of the hands that had built it. He put the Oxfords back in their box, got into his modest car, and drove. He didn't drive to the polished corporate towers of downtown. He drove to the other side of the city, to the forgotten streets where the pavement was cracked and the storefronts were faded. He drove until he found the small, unassuming shop with the hand-painted sign, Second Soul. He sat in his car for an hour, watching. He saw a young mother come in with a pair of worn-out school shoes for her son. Elias greeted her with a gentle smile, took the shoes, and told her to come back in an hour. He saw a construction worker bring in a pair of heavy boots with a split seam. Elias examined them with the same focused intensity Bradley had seen in the gallery. There was no judgment, no condescension. There was only the quiet dignity of the work. Finally, Bradley got out of the car. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered, a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden, heavy silence of the small shop. Elias was at his workbench, his back to the door. He didn't turn around. The air changes when a man with a guilty conscience walks into a room, Elias said, his voice calm. He continued to stitch the sole on the construction worker's boot. It gets heavier. Bradley stood there, feeling like an intruder, a fraud. I didn't come to apologize, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Words are cheap. I've learned that. Yes, Elias agreed, still not turning. You sold a lot of them. A tradition of perfection. Nice words. Meant nothing. I want to learn, Bradley blurted out, the words surprising even himself. I want you to teach me. Elias stopped his work. He slowly put down his awl and needle. He turned on his stool and looked at Bradley, his gaze searching, assessing. He saw not the arrogant CEO, but a broken man searching for something to hold on to. You want to learn to make shoes? Elias asked, a hint of disbelief in his voice. I want to learn how to fix them, Bradley corrected him. I've spent my whole life selling new things. I don't know the first thing about mending something that's broken. He knew he wasn't just talking about shoes. Elias was silent for a long, heavy minute. He looked at Bradley's hands, soft, manicured, uncalloused hands that had never known a day of real labor. The work is hard, Elias said. It's slow. It's dirty. It will break your nails and make your back ache. There is no glory in it. The only reward is the work itself. I know, Bradley said. That's why I'm here. Elias held his gaze for another moment, then nodded slowly. The first lesson is sweeping the floor. The broom is by the back door. And so, Bradley Sterling, the disgraced former CEO of a global luxury brand, began his apprenticeship. He swept the floors of the tiny shop, humbled by the dust of other people's lives. He learned to clean and condition old leather, to unstitch worn-out soles, to sharpen knives until they could shave the hair from his arm. His hands, once soft, became calloused and stained. He was a clumsy student, his movements stiff and uncertain. But he was patient. He was quiet. And for the first time in his life, he was learning the value of his own labor. Meanwhile, Sterling Stride was undergoing its own painful and necessary transformation under Clara's guidance. She had the full backing of Mr. Abernathy and a board of directors desperate to salvage the company's reputation. She gutted the marketing department, firing the people who sold words and replacing them with people who understood things. She invested millions in re-establishing the company's artisan workshop, turning a vast, sterile floor of the corporate headquarters into a place that smelled of leather and beeswax once again. Her biggest challenge came when the company's largest wholesale client, a chain of high-end department stores, demanded they lower the production cost of the Vance collection by 10%. The old Sterling Stride would have complied instantly, finding a cheaper leather supplier in a different country or replacing a crucial hand-stitched element with a machine-glued one. The client's representative, a slick man named Peterson, made it clear it was a take-it-or-leave-it deal. Clara flew to meet him. She didn't bring a PowerPoint presentation or a team of lawyers. She brought a single, half-finished shoe and a set of cobbler's tools. In the middle of their sterile boardroom, she sat down and demonstrated the Greaves interlocking stitch, the Vance stitch. She showed him, with her own hands, the time, the skill, and the integrity that went into each pair of shoes. This stitch, she told him, her eyes burning with a passion he hadn't seen in a boardroom in 20 years, is a promise. It promises that this shoe will not fall apart. It is a promise from the maker to the wearer. If we cut the cost, we break the promise. And Sterling Stride is no longer in the business of breaking promises. Peterson was stunned into silence. He had expected a negotiation. He had received a lesson in morality. The department store signed the contract without the 10% reduction. It was a turning point. Clara had proven that Elias's philosophy was not just a romantic ideal. It was a viable, powerful business model. Honesty, it turned out, was the ultimate luxury. Back at Second Soul, Elias had taken on another apprentice. A quiet, watchful teenager from the neighborhood named Leo. Leo had been heading down a bad path, falling in with the wrong crowd. But he was drawn to the quiet sanctuary of Elias's shop. He started by just watching from the doorway, fascinated by the old man's hands. Elias, recognizing a flicker of the same lonely passion he had once felt, invited him in. Leo was a natural. His hands were quick and steady, and his mind was eager to learn. Elias taught him everything he knew, just as his own father had taught him. He taught him how to read the grain of the leather, how to balance a sole, how to make a stitch that would last a lifetime. In the boy, Elias saw not just a student, but a successor. The legacy, which had once been stolen from him, was now something he could give away freely. 1 year to the day after the disastrous gala, Sterling Stride held another event. It was not in a cold, minimalist gallery. It was held in the new workshop at the company headquarters. The air smelled of craft and creation. There were no champagne fountains or string quartets. Instead, there were workbenches, tools, and the quiet hum of people dedicated to their work. The guests were not just the city's elite. They were journalists, design students, local community leaders, and the company's own factory workers. The centerpiece of the event was not a single, perfect shoe on a pedestal. It was a long workbench where the first graduates of Clara's new apprenticeship program were demonstrating their skills. Clara, dressed in a simple, practical dress, gave a short speech. "A year ago, we as a company were reminded of what we had forgotten," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We had forgotten that our foundation is not our brand, but our craft. It is not our story, but our substance. Tonight, we are not here to launch a product. We are here to celebrate a promise. The promise to honor the work of the hands that build, the hands that create, and the hands that mend." At one of the benches was a young apprentice, carefully stitching a welt. A small crowd was gathered, watching him with quiet respect. Standing just behind him, offering a quiet word of advice, was his teacher, Clara Jenkins. In a quiet corner of the workshop, 2 men stood observing the scene. The first was Elias Vance. He was wearing a simple tweed jacket, a gift from Mr. Abernathy. He looked at the young apprentices, at the earnest passion on their faces, and a deep, quiet satisfaction settled in his heart. The dream he had shared with Arthur Sterling was not dead. It had been wounded, lost for a time, but now it was alive again, breathing in the hands of a new generation. The man standing next to him was Bradley Sterling. He was thinner, his face was lined with a humility he had never known, and his hands were the rough, calloused hands of a man who worked. He was not introduced as a Sterling. He was simply a guest, a friend of the company's new spiritual guide. He watched Clara, and a look of profound, respectful admiration was in his eyes. He had lost an empire, but had found a purpose. He spent his days at Second Soul, learning a quiet, honest trade. His atonement measured not in dollars, but in stitches. A young journalist approached Elias. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice full of awe. "You are the man who started it all. The forgotten founder. After all you went through, after being erased from your own story, how does it feel to be back, to see your legacy finally restored?" Elias watched as Leo, who was also at the event, proudly showed a beautifully repaired boot to a group of interested students. He saw the pride and purpose in the young man's eyes. He turned to the journalist, and a gentle, peaceful smile touched his lips. "A legacy is not what you build for yourself," he said, his voice the quiet, steady sound of truth. "It is not a name carved on a building. A true legacy is what you leave in the hands of others." He had come to the gallery a year ago asking for a piece of bread. He had been given mockery and scorn. But in the end, he had walked away with everything that mattered: his integrity, his craft, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that the best-made things, shoes, companies, and even a man's broken soul, can always be mended as long as one is willing to do the work. The stitch, after all, was meant to hold. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. Thanks for spending this time with me.